Okay, picture this. It's August 24th, 2001, just after midnight. You're on Air Transat Flight 236, a huge Airbus A330. You've got 306 people on board, flying from Toronto all the way to Portugal. For hours, everything's been totally normal, just a quiet, overnight flight cruising high above the dark Atlantic Ocean. But up in the cockpit, a tiny problem is snowballing into an absolute nightmare. So this 200-ton machine, with 306 souls on board, is thousands of feet above this freezing black ocean. And in just a few minutes, both of its massive jet engines are going to go completely silent. The plane is about to be left totally powerless. As this quote says, it was about to become just a glider. And you know what? There was no training for this, no checklist for what was about to happen.
So that's the big question, right? How on earth does a modern airliner just run out of fuel over the ocean? It seems impossible. Well, to get the answer, we actually have to go back in time, 9 days before this flight ever left the ground, where a routine maintenance check accidentally planted a ticking time bomb. So let's talk about that ticking time bomb. The root of this whole terrifying event didn't start with some huge explosion, but with a small mechanical issue found on the ground. A series of what seemed like tiny decisions and little oversights were about to set the stage for a near disaster. It all started back on August 15th. Mechanics found these tiny metal chips in the right engine's oil system, which is a big red flag for internal damage, so they ordered an engine replacement. The problem was the airline didn't have a spare, so they had to get a loaner from Rolls-Royce. 2 days later, they start the replacement, and by August 24th, Flight 236 is back in the air, its fate already sealed by that repair job. And here we get to the real heart of the problem. It's kind of like if your phone charger breaks and you grab a similar looking one that seems to fit, but the wiring inside is just a little bit different. It might work for a while, but you know it's going to fail eventually. That is almost exactly what happened here. The loaner engine was an older model, but the plane's systems were newer. The tubes for the hydraulic fluid and the fuel were just slightly different. We're talking millimeters, but it was a mismatch that was about to have catastrophic consequences. On top of that initial mistake, you had a whole chain of other problems. The mechanics were on a super tight deadline. When they tried to get the official Rolls-Royce manual online, the network was down. And in a crazy failure of communication, they had no idea an offline copy was available on a CD right there in the building. So under pressure, the lead technician took a shortcut. He mixed the old and new parts, and he missed the one critical warning in the manual. You always replace the fuel and hydraulic tubes as a matched set. Always. All right, so let's jump back to the flight, hours into its journey over the Atlantic. Those mismatched tubes, they've been vibrating against each other for a few flights now, and they were just about to break. Up in the cockpit, the crew was about to face a situation they literally couldn't have imagined in their worst nightmares. At 4:38 in the morning, that constant rubbing finally wears a crack in the fuel line. Jet fuel starts pouring out of the plane at an incredible rate. But here's the scariest part. On this Airbus A330, there was no direct warning system for a fuel leak. No alarms, no flashing lights in the cockpit. The plane was silently bleeding out, and the pilots had absolutely no idea. The very first sign of trouble was a little fuel imbalance warning. The right wing tank had way less fuel than the left. Now, the pilots assumed it was just a computer glitch, and this is where they made the single biggest mistake of the entire flight. Instead of grabbing the emergency checklists, they acted from memory and opened the crossfeed valve. This valve is designed to move fuel from one wing to the other to balance things out. What they actually did, though, was create a direct pipeline, sending all the good fuel from the left tank straight into the leaking engine, basically doubling the speed of the leak. That one decision sealed their fate, and it brings us to this next part, the impossible glide. It was no longer a question of if the engines would fail, just when. The point of no return had been crossed, and this flight was about to become a terrifying, silent freefall. At 6:13 a.m., the right engine, completely starved of fuel, flamed out. This massive jet was now flying on one engine over the middle of the ocean. Then, just 13 minutes later, at 6:26 a.m., the left engine went quiet too. The cockpit screens went dark, the cabin lights went out, and an eerie, total silence fell over the plane. They were completely powerless, a 200-ton glider, and the closest possible runway, an airbase in the Azores Islands, was still 144 kilometers away, a distance that felt absolutely, completely impossible to cross without any power at all.
For the next 19 minutes, which must have felt like an eternity, Captain Robert Pichet and his first officer had to pull off a miracle. They were about to attempt the longest powerless glide of a commercial jet in history. Every single second mattered. If they miscalculated, if they fell just a little bit short, the only other option was to ditch the plane at high speed into the cold Atlantic Ocean.
Their one and only hope was this little device called the ram air turbine, or RAT for short. The second the engines died, this little emergency propeller automatically dropped down from the belly of the plane. It uses the airflow from the glide to spin a tiny generator, which creates just enough electricity to power the most essential flight controls and instruments. It was the only thing giving them a fighting chance to actually steer the plane.
Meanwhile, in the main cabin, the sudden, deafening silence was just terrifying. The constant hum of the engines was gone. All you could hear was the wind rushing past the plane. Passengers and even some of the crew were panicking. One flight attendant was so overwhelmed with fear, she actually turned to a passenger and just pleaded, "Please help me." People were told to put on their life jackets, bracing for a water landing they knew very few people survive.
And this brings us to our final section, the lesson and the aftermath. Back in the cockpit, Captain Pichet was tapping into a very unlikely skill. You see, years before, he'd been a glider pilot. He knew how to read the air, how to feel the plane, how to manage its energy in a way that very few airline pilots ever have to. He was using every single ounce of that experience to stretch this glide as far as it could possibly go. At 6:45 a.m., against every possible odd, the wheels of Flight 236 slammed down on the runway. The landing was violent. I mean, without engine power for reverse thrust, the plane came in way too fast. The brakes locked up, all 8 main tires exploded, and sparks even started a small fire in the landing gear. But it was on solid ground, and inside the cabin, sheer terror turned into thunderous applause. Every single one of the 306 people on board had survived.
Captain Pichet was hailed as a global hero for his incredible flying. But then, a pretty shocking detail from his past came out. 20 years earlier, he'd been convicted of smuggling drugs and had actually served time in a U.S. prison. The media, of course, had a field day. But you know what? For the 305 people whose lives he saved, his past didn't matter one bit. To them, he was and still is their hero. So what was the real cause here? Well, it wasn't just one single thing. It was a whole catastrophic chain of events. The best way to think about it is like layers of Swiss cheese. A design flaw in the plane? That's one hole. A poorly communicated warning from the manufacturer? That's another hole. A maintenance shortcut? A third hole. And a critical mistake by the crew? A fourth. On any normal day, these holes don't line up, but on this night, they lined up perfectly, letting disaster shoot straight through every single layer of safety. And that really leaves us with a final thought. The story of Flight 236 is this incredible reminder of how a bunch of small, what seem like insignificant oversights can all line up to create an unbelievable crisis. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many of these tiny mistakes in all parts of our lives are being overlooked every single day, just waiting for the right conditions to come together?